computer games industry is worth more than the movies and the music industry combined. Each year, 2.5 billion of us spend $150 billion on games. Games that put you in the driver's seat. Games that make you the hero of the story, as you collect each power-up, ascend through each level, and finally defeat the big bad boss. But one game challenges all that. Its creators, Ryan and Amy Green, have made a game that's hard to play. In fact, it's a game that's impossible to win, because this game mirrors life. And in real life, you're not in the driver's seat. You don't choose your destiny, and you cannot defeat the big bad boss. Death always wins. That dragon cancer is a memorial to Ryan and Amy's young son, Joel, who for 4 years fought the dragon of brain cancer and lost. There are many things you can do in the game. The one thing you can't do is save Joel. No matter how you play the game, no matter what courses of treatment you choose, that dragon cancer wins. But then, the screen flashes one more time. Loading. It's another level. You find yourself on a boat crossing over to the other side, and there is Joel.
I remember you. You made it too. I'm glad you're here. I love it here. I bet you like it too.
He couldn't avoid death, no one can, but through it, there is freedom, feasting, and joy. You cannot win the game, but you can be carried through death to a life beyond it. You see, Amy and Ryan Green are Christians. They believe in a dragon slayer. But the slayer is not Joel. And he's not us. The true hero is Jesus. And at Easter, he took on the final enemy, death. On the cross, he fought to the death. On Easter Sunday, he gained the victory, and everything is now different. As one hymn puts it, death is dead, love has won, Christ has conquered. Life is not a computer game. Death is not a boss we can defeat. But Easter brings news of a hero. One who can carry us to a life beyond that dragon cancer. And even beyond that dragon, death.
Welcome to the LIVEcast.
Hello.
Which is not actually live, though, is the problem.
It's not live.
Welcome to the not LIVEcast.
Yeah.
But we're still casting. On the 9th of April. We're recording this on the 8th of April, on a Monday. I can't be around today, so that's why we've recorded in advance.
Today.
Tomorrow.
So confusing.
What tense should I use? The pluperfect.
Dear,
my favourite tense.
No. So we're not, you can probably tell we're not in either the Speak Live studio, because it doesn't exist anymore, neither are we in my spare room. No. We're currently billeted at Holy Trinity Eastbourne.
Yes.
I was going to say Brompton. That's just default there.
That's the most famous Holy Trinity.
Of all the...
Yes.
Is it? Really?
It kind of is. Name a more famous Holy Trinity.
I was thinking the Trinity.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Sorry, I forgot God. Holy Trinity Eastbourne have very kindly let us stay where they are so that we can knock down the old studios and put up big, proper studios. And I stood in the studio space just this morning, and it's pretty exciting. It's like massive, tall ceilings, and
I don't know why I looked over there.
Yeah. I made you imagine it. And it's going to be fantastic. And we're going to be able to have lots of different sets. And we were thinking just today, what kind of sets? What sets should we have for the live?
For the live cast, because I mean, this is fine, isn't it? But I mean, you wouldn't want this, would it? It'd be a little bit sterile, just us at a desk. I think.
Yeah. I think a fireplace.
I'm thinking wing-back chairs.
Chairs.
A brandy in one hand.
Chesterfield sofa. Pipes. And ferns everywhere, obviously.
Yep.
Lots of potted plants. But that'll be something in May. We'll be able to get back into our studios. And then from May, we'll start to build different sets that might work for the live cast. But yeah, if you can think of what does the live cast look like when you tear down the blue kind of wallpaper and the
furry
awards,
wall,
and the awards for best
Absolutely.
use of sock puppets in a Christian drama. What should it look like? Well, we shall see. You just saw at the top of the show That Dragon Death. Because we've got a series of videos being released at Easter, and they're all themed around the most devastating computer game ever made, called That Dragon Cancer. And Paul, you've been editing an interview that I gave, or that they gave to me.
Yep.
Ryan and Amy Green, and a quite moving story, really, about taking the tragedy of them losing their son Joel and actually turning it into a memorial that has blessed millions of people. And I think you're in for a real treat with that video that's going to drop next Monday.
Yep.
We have a sort of a 40-minute interview where they really go into their kind of theology of the cross. And I think before the tragedy struck, I think they had very much a theology that God shows up in our midst to heal now. And of course, when your 5-year-old son dies and you've got that theology, something's going to happen. And what happened for them is, Amy sort of said, it's been amazing to us how our entire theology could change, but God could stay the same. You'll have to listen to the interview, but I think they gave such wisdom there, and I think we're going to be blessed by it. And if you want to help us out, give.net/Easter is our crowdfunder for the Easter videos, and we always want to share our videos so that they are free at the point of access, but obviously that's costly to us. But if you want to help us to push out those videos a little further and a little wider, you can go to give.net/Easter and help us with that crowdfunder. And if you just want to share one of the videos, we've released a 15-minute video, which is the documentary, and then a 4-minute video, a much more shareable piece of content that you can either share on social media or perhaps use in church, perhaps on Easter Day. It might serve your resurrection preaching to think about how we can't slay that dragon death, but Jesus has. So, today we are thinking about reaching the negatives. And that's not about sort of reaching pessimists. It's about reaching people who are far from the gospel. What do we do when people are far from the gospel? I've just been in the States, so last week Paul was broadcasting from his bedroom because I was in Indianapolis. Was it your bedroom?
No, it was my spare room.
Spare room.
Yeah, it was my spare room.
Oh, very good. And
that'd be a different kind of set, wouldn't it? It's just me in the bed, just in my gym jams,
cup of cocoa.
Yeah.
So last week you might have met Christiane from the conference. She was pleased to have met Glen Scrivener.
Very overwhelmed. She was very excited.
Why are you never that overwhelmed?
The first time,
it wears off after a while. But yes, I was at an evangelism conference, a conference on evangelism run by the Gospel Coalition, and it really did strike me that America, certainly certain parts of America, are a very different context for evangelism than the unchurched UK. And the question comes, how do we reach those who are very far from the gospel? And one way that people kind of want to measure how far people are from the gospel is using the Engels scale. James Engel, back in 1975, published this book on what's gone wrong with the harvest, and he came up with this scale. And if you're in the negatives, you're not yet a Christian, and you might start off at -8. But really, a conversation with someone who is far from the gospel, said Engels, is not really about the conversion step, necessarily. The conversion step would be to go from -1 to 0 and to begin your Christian journey. And Engels said, well, actually, if you move someone from -7 to -6, that's amazing. If you move someone from -8 to -5, that's an incredible conversation, even though they're still far from converting.
It's not about closing the deal, necessarily.
Not about closing the deal, but helping people on their journeys. And what was interesting to me, I just looked up the original Engels scale, because lots of people have kind of adapted his Engels scale. But originally, in 1975, his scale went back to -8. That's as far from the gospel as you can get. But in 1975, -8 for Engels was awareness of a supreme being, but no knowledge of the gospel. I just thought that was very interesting. Back in 1975, the furthest from the gospel that Engels could kind of imagine, in terms of having a fruitful gospel conversation, is that someone who had an awareness of God already, they just needed to hear the gospel. And I just thought that's very interesting. And these days, when people use the Engels scale, they tend to start at -10. Someone who has no knowledge of God whatsoever, an atheist. And I just wonder how many of my conversations evangelistically actually don't even fit onto the Engels scale. They're sort of -9 or -10. And it just goes to show that different contexts will require different thinking when it comes to evangelism. But what do we do with those who are kind of far from the gospel? And it seems to me there are sort of two camps when it comes to those who are far from the gospel. You have the 1 Corinthians 1 camp, and you have the Acts 17 camp. So, Paul, you got 1 Corinthians 1 in front of you. So, what are the 1 Corinthians 1 type people saying when it comes to reaching the unreached?
So, I mean, particularly, we're saying that the way to do it really is about simply preaching Christ crucified. I mean, that's the classic, isn't it? So, 1 Corinthians 1:20. Let's go from 22. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. And that's the kind of classic, isn't it? People often say, well, what is at the heart of what we want to proclaim? It's this. It's Christ crucified. And so if we're not doing that, what are we doing? Wasting our time. And
those who are seeking for wisdom, Paul's decidedly not giving them what they're seeking, which is fascinating. There are these Greeks who are demanding wisdom.
Yeah, foolish. Yeah, and these things are foolishness. To the Gentiles, stumbling block to the Jews. What was it? It was Dawkins, isn't it? Where he says something like, was it Lennox who asked Dawkins something along the lines of, "Could you conceive of a God?" And he said something like, he could, but the idea that God came to earth and died on a cross, lived as a carpenter, died on a cross, it's just so petty.
Yes.
That was his kind of word.
It's unworthy of the universe.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And actually that's precisely what this kind of thing talks about, isn't it? If God is going to show up and do something, surely God will be the powerful, majestic figure, full of awe and wonder, not this man who comes and bleeds and dies on a cross. Yeah. It just looks so petty and pathetic and foolish.
And yet even those who are asking for wisdom from that mindset, Paul explicitly doesn't offer them that. He puts a stumbling block in their way, which is that's not very nice, putting a stumbling block, literally laying down a stone in front of people so they will stumble on it. What kind of nasty piece of work does that? Well, Paul does. And and yet he goes on to say that actually preaching Christ and Him crucified is the wisdom of God, and it is the power of God. It's just not the wisdom or the power that people had thought that they wanted. And so he gives them something entirely different that turns out to be wise, and it turns out to be powerful, but not in the way that the wise and powerful had imagined. So the 1 Corinthians 1 school is just, would kind of say, everyone who has an objection to Christian faith, it's just a smokescreen for unbelief, really.
Sure.
They don't really want to know. They say they want to be wise, but when you actually offer them the wisdom of Christ and Him crucified, they just think of it as folly. So from a 1 Corinthians 1 sort of point of view, you treat every objection to the faith as a kind of a smokescreen for unbelief, and you preach Christ and Him crucified. That's 1 Corinthians 1. But then on the other side, you've got this other school of apologetics, and it draws from Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens. It's the very heart of where wisdom lies. Here are all the Greek philosophers. They are at the Areopagus. And I love in Acts 17 verse 21, now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. That's kind of all of Greek philosophy in a footnote, just dismissed. And what does Paul do? Well, actually, it does say that in verse 17, he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. And it says he goes into the marketplace. And in verse 18, there are these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, and they say, what does this babbler wish to say? He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And I'm always amazed by Paul's first move with these cultured Greek philosophers is to preach Jesus and the resurrection, which are the two most nuts ideas that a Greek person could ever imagine. It's like Jesus. Who the heck is Jesus? Like there's nobody Jewish rabbi, self-styled Jewish rabbi, who was never a part of the establishment, never went through the accepted schools, never wrote a book, right? Never led an army, never entered political office, never entered, military service. And yet here he is. I'm meant to listen to this guy who's crucified in his 30s. Okay, Jesus and the resurrection. And resurrection to the Greek mind is just like vulgar, just disgusting. Just, the body is a tomb. We don't want to be embodied, do we? And Paul is like, no. Let me tell the good news of this, this loser rabbi who was crucified as an enemy of the state. And let me, wrap it on about how we're going to have bodies forever. Hooray! And the Greek mind just thinks this is nuts and vulgar. And they just think he's a babbler. And then, Paul goes to 30,000 feet from verse 22, and he gives them the big picture. But when he gives them the big picture, he basically says, look, everything you know about God is actually wrong. So from verse 23, he says, as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And there's a question then, like, is Paul is he building a bridge with the Athenians? Is he basically saying, yeah, you basically know God, let me fill in the details? Or is he saying, the one thing you guys know about God is that you don't know Him? And I tend towards the latter interpretation. But within the school of apologetics that turns to Acts 17, it's very important that Paul is building bridges here. And so someone who camps out in Acts 17 sees Paul as building bridges and seeing how there is truth in what the Athenians are thinking and building on that a kind of a Christian worldview. Because he does actually quote from their poets. It's like, quoting from the rock songs, As Bruce Springsteen once sang, everyone's got a hungry heart. And so you see... If you camp out in Acts 17, you see the utility in quoting the authors in that cultural space, and he leads to a kind of a gospel appeal by saying that God has fixed a day when He will judge the world in righteousness. He's given proof of this to all people by raising that man from the dead. That's Acts 17 verse 31, and so he leads to a gospel kind of conclusion. And those people in Acts 17 who like Acts 17 a lot tend to say that this is sort of stepping stones evangelism. You take people from the Athenian worldview to the Christian worldview. But I just don't think it's I don't think that's what's going on here. I think he is quoting their own poets, he is quoting their own philosophers, but he's quoting them against their own cultural narrative. He's basically saying, you know, the poets say, in God we live and move and have our being. If you really thought that, why are you building little houses for God in Athens? Why are you building these little temples for God? Like that doesn't make sense, and you're even contradicting your own poets. So he does quote their poets, but he quotes their poets against them, really. Not really as stepping stones towards his own view of things. So to me, Acts 17, even though it's often quoted as, it's often used as sort of vindication for a stepping stones kind of evangelism, don't really think it is. I think Acts 17 and 1 Corinthians 1 is basically saying the same thing. You know? He is basically preaching Christ and him crucified, this vulgar, ridiculous concept, you know. So, is reaching the negatives about building stepping stones and trying to get people from a -8 to a -7, and then a -7 to a -6? I don't think so. I think what Paul is modeling here is actually, he wants to talk about who is God, you know. And he goes back to real basics with the Athenians. You know, God doesn't live in your houses. We live in God's house. He goes right back to the who is God question. And that's interesting to me because, like, at the Gospel Coalition conference, I did a little panel discussion with some other evangelists, and we were at one stage asked, what is the sort of the one doctrine that we feel we really need to cling on to in a secular age to be able to preach the gospel, especially to the youth. And it really struck me that the one thing we really need to do is to start off with which God are we talking about, and to be really clear that we're talking about the Jesus God. But somebody else who watched that video sort of reflected back to me and said, it's interesting that those who are in a more churched setting, it wasn't as obvious to them that we needed to go back to the which God question. Whereas it seems to me that the more you are encountering people who are -8, -9, -10 on the Engels scale, the more you actually realize we just need to go right back to basics and figure out which God are we talking about. So should we have a look at that panel discussion, and then off the back of that, we'll think about how we actually address the question of which God we're talking about in evangelism.
Centered theology and a knowledge of God that is focused in Christ is just so vital. I do a lot of evangelism with adults as well as youth, and my rule of thumb is always if someone is over 55 and they tell me that they're a Christian, I don't believe them. At least not right away, because there's such a thing as nominal Christianity. You know, I'm not rude about it. I don't poke them in the chest and say, you know, sing a few hymns or something. But it has been easier for an older generation to look at the labels that are out there and pick the Christian label and put it on and go out into the world. And we know there's such a thing as nominal Christianity. But I speak to a lot of under 25s, and when they tell me that they're an atheist, I don't believe them. And for the very same reason. Because it's very, very easy today to go to a shelf full of labels and to find the atheist label and to put it on and go out there into the world. And you haven't done more than 5 minutes of philosophical thinking about, you know, materialism, but you're an atheist. You know, are you really? Well, it's just an identity that helps you to navigate the world a little less frictionlessly, a little more frictionlessly. So there is such a thing as nominal atheism. And so my question to over 55s is, you know, which God do you believe in? My question to under 25s is, which God don't you believe in? Yeah. And usually they end up describing some distant individual, high on power, low on personality, kind of a Thor figure with a thunderbolt ready to hurl. And I just say, well, it sounds like Thor. I don't believe in Thor. Can I tell you about Jesus? And I'm always using the phrase the Jesus God. I picked it up from an Iranian woman who'd sort of escaped from Iran when she became a Christian. She'd become a Christian because her uncle had given her a copy of the Gospel. She read through the Gospel. She got halfway through Luke's Gospel. And she said, I realized that God cannot be the God of the Ayatollahs. He must be the Jesus God. And I love that phrase. I've been using that phrase ever since that moment. So I do think the big doctrine that I'm just always
preaching, when I'm speaking to youth in particular, is let's be talking about the Jesus God. When I say God, I'm picturing, most particularly, I'm picturing a man on the cross with his arms wide open to the world, bleeding for his enemies. I don't know what you're thinking of when you think of God, but I think if we are to really shape our thoughts in Christ and in Christ crucified, then that's the sort of thing that we should say, and it's the sort of thing that's really compelling, especially for youth.
I agree.
Well, I agree, actually. I can't remember what passage I was preaching, but it was quite a few years ago, and I said something near the beginning about, what words would you want to define, what's the kind of Christianese words that we use that people outside the church might not understand, and I got people to talk about it for a few minutes, and people talked about, sin and stuff. And there was a few suggestions that cropped up, and I said, I've made my own list, and I said, and some of those have come up, and I said, but the one that I think we need to define is God, because it really winds me up, actually.
Go on.
Really winds me up.
Come on, tell me how much.
It really winds me up when I hear Christians talking generically about God, just this God figure, and there's no reference to Jesus. I've heard whole testimonies given where people have talked about God with no reference to Jesus, and you just think I do sit through those, and I just think, well,
maybe.
Do you understand the gospel?
Yeah.
If you've not even referenced Jesus in your testimony, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think there is this. We just assume people know what God means when we say God or who God is. But I mean, so for instance, recently I helped on the Life Explored course at my church, and there was a lady on the course who said, oh, well, actually, I believe all this stuff, so I don't really know why I'm here, And that's a bit of a red flag in my mind anyway, when someone says, I don't think I need to really be here.
Yeah.
And then one of the weeks, it was about 3 weeks in before the course started, she said something like she'd watched a documentary about Islam, and she said, I think it's important to learn about other faiths and see what they believe, because, they believe in this. And she said, do we believe in some kind of afterlife? And I was like, yes we do. And she was like, okay, but not reincarnation. And I was like, no. And I was thinking, yeah, you probably do need to be here. Just all these things, just I'm not sure you really understand Christianity. You've got this kind of generic religious God thing going on.
And you don't mind the Jesus brand.
Jesus is great, but but surely he fits in with all the other bits.
Yes.
No, not really.
I like the spirituality brand, and the Jesus sub-brand seems strong, but no particular allegiance.
Strong branding.
It's a strong brand. That cross thing. It's very recognizable. It's got a lot of market penetration, the cross. But
the thing is, I think you said before, haven't you, that can you imagine, Elijah talking about God, and the prophets of Baal being like, yeah, we believe in God.
Yeah.
And Elijah being like, great.
Let me just tweak your doctrine of God slightly, because I think although you believe in Baal and he's a big green monster, actually Yahweh's a little bit less green. And when you were talking to your youth, none of them said that God was a term that needed to be redefined.
That wasn't with the youth. That was in the main church. It was
in the main church, and no Christians.
No one
God.
came up with that off the bat without me throwing it out there.
Yeah. Wow.
It's like you say. I think we just assume people understand what we're talking about when we say God, and I don't think people do.
And so what does Paul do in Acts 17? He doesn't build on their knowledge of God at all. He from verse 24, he says, look, the God who made the world and everything in it does not live in temples made by men. And he's doing that, looking around it all the time, here are all your gods. God's not like that. You don't make a house for God. God's made a house for you. You've got to totally turn your thinking on its head, 180 degrees. Like, he's not building on their knowledge of God at all. So I think Paul is channeling the spirit of Elijah here. I think he's far more like with the prophets of Baal here in Acts 17. And the number one thing he kind of targets is the doctrine of God. Okay, let's start with God, because you guys have got that totally backwards. Let me tell you about God. God is not just one being within the created order. And that's one thing you should say about God, especially to somebody like Richard Dawkins, who says, I don't believe in God and I don't believe in the flying spaghetti monster, as though those two things are in any way equivalent, as though God is some item within the created order who's just hiding behind the planet Neptune or something. No, God doesn't live in our world, we live in God's world. So on that level, asking which God is really important. But most vitally, we believe in the Jesus God.
And it is important, isn't it? And I remember someone saying to me once, like, you're not one of those Christians who thinks that we need to talk about the Trinity and evangelism, are you? Like it was this new fad, like, like why would you talk about what God is actually like when you're talking in evangelism? Why would you do that?
Why would you complicate matters like that?
Heck.
Yeah.
And it's really resonated with me. It stuck with me, not only because it's striking, because you just think, well, why wouldn't you? But also just because there was such vitriol in the the questioning of it. Why would you do that?
Spoiled our game. I wonder whether it is about spoiling the game, though. I wonder, because if you start with Trinity, you're instantly doing an Apostle Paul and saying everything you've known about God is like not what the Christian doctrine is. Because I wonder whether people don't want to start with the Trinity because they want to start with a point of connection. And the Trinity is not connecting with people because no one else has such a nuts doctrine of God. So maybe it's because they want to do the stepping stones thing.
Exactly, but then maybe it is that. But of course, the connection is there, isn't it? Because, you often talk in your stuff about, a God who is love and all the things we value most, love and relationships and all those things. And so there is a connection in there, isn't it? But it's not to what their view of God is. It's just to their whole experience of life.
Yes.
So the fact that you often in evangelism you're saying things like, don't we all find that those relationships and those things are the best parts of life? And that does resonate with people. That does connect with people. And you go, is it possible that is because you come from a God who is like that, who is a God of relationship and love and yada, yada, yada. So you are kind of connecting it in, but just by saying, well, this is what God is like, not by saying, here's your view and let me connect into your view about God. There's a view, you're connecting to their view about something else. Even if their view of God is radically off kilter with the Bible.
But that then shapes your evangelism according to cross and resurrection. Because actually the first thing you're doing is kind of putting to death their view of God. But then on the far side of it, you've actually got a God who makes sense of their whole world. So you do want to make a connection, but Jesus himself makes the connection by saying, no, not your thing, my thing, but actually my thing connects to your thing. And Dan Strange has written brilliantly on this stuff. He's the vice principal of Oak Hill Theological College in North London, but he talks about subversive fulfillment. And you need both. Jesus is not just the fulfillment. He doesn't just say, hey, would you like better skin and, a girlfriend? Then here, that would be fulfillment, right? And he doesn't just do subversion. He doesn't just say, everything you want is stupid, you moron. He does subversive fulfillment. He says, you are a moron. Because you're looking for love in all the wrong places, let me put to death that idea and raise up for you something that truly does fulfill you in a way that you'd never imagined. But it's got to take that journey of cross and resurrection. But so this issue of who is God, I don't think we should try to build a stepping stone from an agreed doctrine of God and then say, but there's this nuance over here called Trinity. I do think you sort of start with this surprising doctrine of God that then gives you what you want.
And I just wonder whether we always overcomplicate these things, and because there's a sense in which you just kind of want to go, or at least I feel I want to go in evangelism. I kind of just want to say, I don't even really want to have to do evangelistic talks. I'd rather sit down with someone and say, well, why don't we just read some gospel, and then you can see Jesus, and we'll go from there, really. Because I kind of feel like if people actually look at Jesus, like, I mean, that's going to do most of the work for you.
Right.
But so often we've almost got trying to get this formula or something to get people to a certain point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just want evangelism should be so simple. It's just be like, here's Jesus.
Right.
Have a look,
Yeah.
He's all right, isn't he? Like,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it should be. You open up the Bible and say, "Hey, Jesus, huh?" And
then just go, he says this, what do you think about that?
What do you think? Yeah.
And as people read, like you say with the Iranian woman, she read it and she kind of went, yeah, this guy must be God. Like,
right. But then someone will say, okay, but you don't understand the Engel scale, right? On the Engel scale, there are people who are back at -6, -7, -8.
I don't think Paul understood the Engel scale either.
He totally didn't. He could have been much more contextualized. Paul in Acts 17 needs to be more contextualized than that. Yeah, but I think if you buy into the idea that you need to bring people, and then if you focus on the -6s to the -10s and say the loving thing to do is to take people gently by the hand, step by step, towards conversion. I don't see that that's what people are doing in the Bible, and I don't think it works.
Well, no, you can't have it as a strategy, but it just naturally happens, though, doesn't it?
Right.
I mean, it's not that you're
descriptively.
You don't sit there with a friend and think. Well, I don't sit there with someone and think. He's probably at -6 about now. So let's see if we can get him to 5, -5. See how we go. But you do have conversations, and you know that person hasn't become a Christian off the back of it, but you hope that it's brought them a little bit closer.
Yes.
But then I did a talk on Isaiah 6 once about evangelism and what is successful evangelism. And like Isaiah is told, isn't he, to go and go and proclaim kind of the message that the Lord has given him, but he's told that basically no one's ever going to respond. And so the question I was asking was, is Isaiah a rubbish evangelist? Is he a failure? And I was basically saying, well, no, because he did what he was asked to do. He faithfully proclaimed what he did, and people's response to it makes no difference. And you read Acts 1, and it talks about being a witness. Now, I talked about if you're a witness to a crime and you go to court and you say exactly what you saw faithfully and truthfully, and the jury don't believe you, that is no reflection on you as a witness, And I think sometimes we think being an evangelist means like scoring the goal and getting the touchdown. But if you think of being a witness and you're just proclaiming the truth of what you've heard and seen and know, then if you walk, even if you get to the end of the conversation and someone says, I think that's absolute rubbish, you're deluded. In terms of you as an evangelist, you have done a good job in faithfully proclaiming the word, hopefully.
Whereas if you have been a witness on trial, and because you've manipulated the truth, you've actually got the conviction when it's been false. You're actually a bad witness.
Lying for the Lord. That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Just tell the truth. That's what you're called to.
And it's in how simple I think sometimes evangelism is. It's the demoniac, isn't it, where Jesus basically says, just go and tell what the Lord has done for you.
Yeah.
And he doesn't say like, make sure you've got a worked out, theology, a doctrine of this, and this. He just says, tell your story of what I have done for you.
Yes.
And like actually anyone can do that, and it doesn't have to be a kind of down to pat. Here's my. Whatever outline it is, and here's how this works.
Yeah,
it's just a witness to what God has done in your life.
Yes.
That itself is a proclamation of the gospel in some form.
And I think that's something that the Engel scale kind of misses, because it's all focused on how do you get someone from the negatives forwards, whereas doesn't the gospel actually encounter people? Isn't Christ's word actually heading in the other direction? That, from Christ and him crucified, there is a message going out that meets people in their sin and in their lostness. So the God's eye perspective is actually of the gospel going out towards the negatives. And obviously, from an anthropological point of view, you know, the man's eye view is that we are, you know, ascending towards God. And in one sense, you can reflect back on someone's conversion, and you can see, yeah, they took a step, and they took a step, and they took a step. But that's a bit like, you know, Lazarus, you know, after he's been raised from the dead, you know, he's at the barbecue, the funeral has turned into the barbecue, and he's regaling people with tales of how he raised himself from the dead, you know.
Yeah.
And everyone else is going, yeah, okay, yeah. There's another perspective on that, Lazarus.
So are you saying that we often think about, like, we're trying to draw people in to, like, this central thing, but actually it's going out.
Yeah. The gospel is... Yeah, the angle scale is kind of depending on where we're bringing people towards God. And the gospel is God goes out towards us, you know. And we just... For every minute we spend thinking about this very human perspective, I think we should spend at least 5 minutes thinking about, you know, God's perspective of how the gospel goes out and encounters people in their lostness. We recently did an apologetics day, I guess, at St. Catherine's, a Church of England school in Eastbourne. And the chaplain there did a great job of sort of stirring up lots of people to ask questions.
Mostly about wasps.
Wasps was the number one question.
So sick of the wasp question by the end of that. 5 hours of wasps.
I still don't think I've got a good answer to the wasps question. I don't really get it as an objection. But you know, it was like teenager after teenager after teenager wanted to know about why did God allow wasps. And at the end of like 5 hours or something like that of kind of trying to answer objections from teenagers, the chaplain just quietly said to us both, yeah, people just don't like God very much, do they? Which is a brilliant encapsulation of 5 hours of trying to answer difficult apologetic questions. People don't like God very much,
Well, the difficulty about that, I think, it was a good morning. And you never know what people take away from it, but particularly in the setting we were in, you come away feeling like, I don't know, I came away feeling like just no one wanted to really be there and hear what you had to say anyway. Mm-hmm. Like they'd been brought into this situation and made to sit through us, you know. You know, just that's it. Yeah. In a sense, hard work.
Yeah. There's that. But, you know, it's not as though we believe, you know, because we're 1 Corinthians 1 people, it's not as though, you know, whenever anyone asks a question, we say, who are you, oh man, to answer back to God? You know, like we don't, that's just a smokescreen for unbelief. But what it does mean is that you take every opportunity, you take every question as an opportunity to preach the gospel, you know, even if it's wasps, you know. You know, God created all things good, and there was a fall, and that means wasps. But you know, Jesus comes to redeem. You try to tell a gospel story because that's really the power of God for salvation, rather than a brilliant, you know, academic treatise on wasps. You know,
so maybe if you CCF are listening, maybe some lunch bars next year on wasps.
Lunch bars on wasps.
Clearly, it's the question people are asking.
It's what the kids want to know. What are we doing about the wasps question? But I was online recently and came across this little video from Dominic Steele, who, in a very provocative little minute, at least posed a question about apologetics, and then in particular about how we advertise apologetic questions more publicly. And I thought it'd be very interesting to hear his thoughts on this.
So gets my goat is the stupidity of the strategy of advertising apologetic questions. So you've picked a 4-week apologetic series, you're going to do it, and you advertise it on Facebook or wherever it is, and the Bible's a myth, ? Or
is God irrelevant?
Is God irrelevant, ? Or even worse, God is irrelevant.
Yeah, is God a tyrant?
Or is God a tyrant? And 99% of the people who see that ad don't come. But it's worked. It's like Coca-Cola running an ad saying, does soft drink taste bad in cans? Well, I hadn't had that thought until then. But you've just given me, oh yeah, that's a really dumb way to drink. Now, I just can't... Marketing 101 says that is stupid. Anyway.
So it's a negative message.
It's a negative message. Don't do it.
You want to sell the positive.
Let the non-Christians do that. You do the positive message.
I do like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do like that.
I really like it because he says the kind of things I know I find myself saying, and I'm just really pleased it's someone else saying it and taking the flak for it and not me for once. So it's nice.
You will after this episode.
Yeah. But I completely agree. So no, we were talking about this earlier, and I was just like, my concern. Like when you do these lunch bars, you just think sometimes...
Lunch bars are sort of student talks that you give at a lunchtime.
The kind of apologetic questions. And there are just times when I come away and I think, like, is anybody even asking these questions, really? I mean, given the fact that 99% of people don't turn up for them, I'm like... Yeah. And I think... it worries me a little bit, because I think about, even when we do our thorny questions... And, to be honest, if you look 6 months down the line back at some of them and you think, 400 views, after 6 months, you just think, is anyone even... People are asking these questions, like... And then we were saying earlier, in terms of marketing, I mean, if you had a self-help guru come to your university, there's no way they would market it in that way. It would always be like, how to have a fulfilling life. It would always be something really positive.
Yes.
And then people will be like, "Ooh,
yes,
I want to go to that." And actually, it's like sometimes I don't know. Sometimes it's just like we forget we've got good news to tell people, and it's like we're starting on the defensive, assuming people have all these questions and accusations against Christianity. When I think the reality is that we're so unchurched now that most people aren't even aware of objections to Christianity because they don't know enough about Christianity to object to it.
So they just come up with wasps.
Well, like wasps.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is the case. Because I'm surprised how... Maybe it's because we spend so much time thinking about these kind of big questions of life from our context here. I'm often just surprised how many people just... people aren't thinking about this every day.
No.
People aren't thinking about the big questions of life, because most people, they're just thinking like, I've got to get the kids to school in the morning, and I've got to get the lunches made, and like now I've got to go and do all the washing, and I've got to do this, and they're not stopping to ponder like, is my existence completely meaningless? And so I just think like, how do you actually connect to people?
Yeah.
And I said to you earlier, it would be really interesting to know, when people get surveyed and you say, what's one question you could ask God? I mean, people then are deliberately thinking something religious, aren't they?
Yes.
But I wondered if there was a way of surveying people to say, like, what's your big question of life, without a religious context to it? What's the thing you're aiming for, hoping for, the things that worry you, concern you? I don't know.
Yes.
It'd be interesting to see what those things are, because I think...
Yes.
Because I truly believe the gospel would speak into those things anyway.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot of Christian unions are doing that with their lunchtime talks. Like, we were in Southampton for the human mission. And, what is it that makes us human? And what about meaning and significance and joy and hope and forgiveness and all these sorts of things that people, are concerned with. And so I think there are some really good models of how people are trying to engage the campus and how people are trying to engage non-Christians. But, what Dominic Steele is talking about are those provocative, questions where you're just trolling people.
It's a clickbait title, isn't it? That's what it is. Yeah.
I always talk about the one where it was, why does God hate women? And the Christian Union did not want me speaking on that issue. They got a woman to speak on that issue, and she spoke brilliantly. And I was just in the audience doing what evangelists do when they're in the audience, just stealing all her illustrations one by one. And and in the Q&A time, there was this angry atheist who got hold of the microphone and just asked her every single question about homophobia, about holy war, about hell, and just all these talking points. And everyone's shoulders were getting up around our ears, and it was just the most awkward thing for 15 minutes before some poor student had to get up and say, right, well, that's all the time we've got for. Hopefully you'll come back tomorrow. Please come back tomorrow. And they played the music, and the event was at an end. And our shoulders shoulders were still up around our ears. But I just turned to my neighbour and I said, what did you make of that? And he thought for a second, and then he pointed to the atheist who'd been asking the questions. And he said, I wasn't listening to anything he said, but my granddad just died and I'm wondering what life is about. Do you have any thoughts? And I had some thoughts, and away we went, and we had a brilliant conversation for an hour, and he came back that night and he prayed to receive Christ that night, and he's still going on as a Christian. And you just think, like, everyone else in the room thought that the guy with the microphone was the mouthpiece for where people were at, and the Christians were thinking, oh yeah, that's what unbelievers are thinking. Unbelievers are exactly like that angry atheist with the microphone. And, non-Christians might think, oh, that's what it is to not be a Christian. Well, but actually, people just have lost their grandfather and they want to know what life's about.
But isn't it, and it's so true, isn't it? Because when you go and do a Q&A type thing, or even if you do one particular topic, or even if you're not doing a whole week, you've always got in the back of your mind, what if someone asked the question about this, right, or this? And you've got your kind of, how do I respond to the sexuality question? How do I respond to this question, that question? And you're kind of going just with a series of answers ready in your head, because you can imagine the angry atheist getting up and hitting you with this, that, and the other, holy war or whatever. Yeah. And the reality is, so many that just people aren't asking those questions on the whole. No. I mean,
that guy is so rare. But he's got a microphone and he yells loudly, and the new atheists have yelled very, very loudly. And I think we Christians have thought, oh, that's where society is at, and society's not there at all. It's like, I'm always quoting this statistic that Hope and the Evangelical Alliance and the Church of England did this big survey a couple of years ago, and they asked people, do you think that Christians are homophobic? And 7% said yes, and that means 93%, like, that's not on their radar. And yet we always disqualify ourselves from having a conversation. We don't want to stick our head above the parapet and say I'm a Christian, because we just feel we're going to get shot down as a homophobic bigot. And, like, literally for 93% of the people, they
won't even cross their minds.
Won't even cross their minds. Yeah. And so we fear being censored by the angry guy with the microphone, but actually it's just ourselves. We're just censoring ourselves.
And isn't it? I mean, you open Mark's Gospel, and literally line number 1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and you think, well, we've got good news now. I can't think of another context where you think, how can I announce good news? Let me think of the way someone might object to this, and I'll couch it in that way first, in order to announce it. Like, I don't know, it's just a really weird way of doing things. It's like we don't trust enough that we've got something good to say in the first place. I mean, wouldn't it be, in a sense, I would prefer not to have to do talks on science and faith again, or, more of this one, more of that one. You just want to kind of go, here's a story about Jesus meeting so-and-so. Wow, isn't this great? And then off the back of that stuff might come, and you just want to kind of open up and go, here's some Jesus, here's some Jesus, here's some Jesus. What do you think of Jesus? Do you like this Jesus? He's pretty good, isn't he, this Jesus? And because it's easy to do all those talks and almost feel like you've not really had a proper gospel opportunity in there, but you're just deflecting intellectual academic ideas in order that someone else maybe later can talk about Jesus.
Right. And that is answering the who is God question. The which God? It's the Jesus God, the Jesus God. And I think if that's front and center in what we're thinking about as evangelism, then you can just present Jesus. Whereas if you're thinking that Christianity is a worldview, then there are various planks within that worldview that you've got to explain, and you've got objections to deal with, and that sort of thing. Whereas if you just raise a banner for, here is Jesus, over this way, but if somebody says, that's fine, Paul, but there are many people who are not ready to hear about Jesus, how do you love them? What do you say? So that, you just want to do a talk from Mark chapter 1, verse 1, right? No, people aren't ready to hear it. People won't come if they just say it's, Paul Feasy's going to give a talk on Mark chapter 1, verse 1. They won't come to that. So how do you love people who are -6?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I think actually love them might be I don't know, like because people say that to me, and they're like, how do we love people who are, angry atheists and why not actually love them?
Yeah, the thing is, So the problem is the question's out of context, isn't it? Because the reality is, like, how do you love? The reality is that often, probably the majority of people listening, and even us, our day-to-day experience of the -6 person, if we want to use that kind of thing, is not at a lunch bar where they're coming to hear a talk. It's that they're your next door neighbour, or you work with them, or they're a family member, or a friend, or whatever. And actually, when you put it in that context and you realise we're not talking about an event with a talk, you can kind of see how it's easy just to love them in that setting, like your next door neighbour or whoever. And that is a powerful witness in itself.
So if we put on events and the -6s, 7s, 8s, 9s and 10s don't come or don't even think of coming, I don't think that's a massive loss necessarily. You absolutely want to love everybody and love everybody on the Engel scale, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to tailor your speaking events to that demographic. I think, let's actually love people at that end of things, and let that be a massive part of our apologetic. John chapter 13, verse 35, Jesus says, "By this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." So there's a massive apologetic value to actually just loving them. And then, what about praying for them? If we spent as much time talking to God about our friend as we did talking to our friend about God, that could be incredibly powerful, actually. And when I think about some of the debates I've had long into the night with non-Christian friends, and, I might have spent 4 or 5 hours on the trot talking to them about God, I don't think I've ever spent 4 or 5 hours talking to God about my friend. But why, so love them, pray for them. And then I think kind of the importance of storms coming into their life, that actually, you can build on sinking sand for a long time, and you can think you're doing brilliantly building on sinking sand. But when the storm hits, you realize that your foundations are not solid. And that's when you're ready to hear of the rock of Christ. And actually, as a severe mercy, God often brings storms into people's lives. And one of the talks at the Gospel Coalition last week, Tim Keller kind of mentioned about the plagues, and how in early Christianity, one of the things that really marked Christians out and got the whole empire kind of noticing Christians was that when the plague hit the city, everyone was running out of the city, and Christians were running into the city to care for the sick and the dying in this incredible way. And actually, when suffering hits and when Christians are able to model that they handle suffering differently, that's just huge. And I was reminded of that just yesterday when I was reading about Candida auris. There's a new plague, people, and it's this silent killer, and it's untreatable by antibiotics, and it's killing people the world over. Great gospel opportunity. So that's my take home. Plagues are good for the gospel. Plagues were good for the gospel in Exodus. Plagues were good for the gospel in the early church. And actually, what I do mean by that is that when suffering hits, the church has an opportunity to model something different in the way they respond to suffering. And it might not be an apologetic talk that wins over the -7, the -8. It might be Christians showing that they can live a little bit differently. And then, like, the last thing to say, I think, on what do we do with the negatives, what do we do with the people who are way down the end of the Engel scale, is the spiritual practice of moving on. And I just think that's huge, actually. In the New Testament, people move on all the time. So the parable of the 4 soils, you sow on one soil, you sow on the next, you sow on the next, and some people are going to be hard, some people are going to be stony, some people are going to be choked by consumerism and worries. You just move on because you've got good seed and there is good soil out there. So keep on sowing, and Jesus talks about shaking the dust off your feet if people won't receive you. And he says, don't cast pearl before swine. And, even in Acts 17, Paul
preaches the gospel. Some believe, some sneer. Paul leaves, and he moves on. And I don't mean that you move on from your, non-Christian sister who, doesn't trust in Jesus. You don't stop loving the loved ones in your life, but you do go quiet for a bit. If they go quiet on the gospel, you go quiet, and you don't bring it up again till Christmas. But the spiritual practice of actually moving on is what I see in really practiced evangelists. When I see Roger Carswell, when I see Adrian Holloway, I see these people who've been around the block a number of times, and they know that they've got good seed, and they know that there is good soil out there, and so they don't continually cram the seed into the path and say, "You stupid path, why don't you see how reasonable this is?" They move on, And I just think, if I was in Acts 17, if I was the Apostle Paul and there were people sneering at me in the Areopagus, I'd get really upset and offended, and I would think, how dare you sneer at me? I am intellectual. I can go toe-to-toe with you, Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. I can, don't sneer at me. This is intellectually credible. And I would start up Areopagus ministries, and, I would bed down in Athens and try to at least defend the reasonableness of the gospel to all those sneerers. And I just think Paul does something different,
That's fair. Yep.
It seems like he sort of lays hands on Damaris and Dionysius, because they are named as believers in Athens, and it seems like they kind of probably lead the church from then on, and he kind of hands it over to them. Paul moves on. And what do we do with the -6s, -7s, -8s? Well, I think we love them, we pray for them, we try to model handling suffering in a distinctive way, and we move on.
Yeah.
I think. Anyway, just some thoughts on how we reach the negatives. If you've got thoughts on how we reach the negatives, love to hear about them in comments. Let us know. And do be sharing around the place our Easter videos. If you want to see all the videos in one place, you can go to speaklife.org.uk/dragon. And we'd love to see those go far and wide. So please do share them on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it.
Yep, get them out there.
And stay tuned for next Monday, when the interview with Ryan and Amy Green will drop on the Monday night.
Yeah, we'll get that out.
And all being well, this will be a podcast that drops on Friday.
Should be, yep.
Brilliant. Well, guys, thanks for joining us. And next week we should be live, I think, on the Tuesday. Oh yeah. Okay. Paul won't be here. We'll figure something out for next week. But thanks for being with us, and we'll see you again soon.
Cool. Take care.
Bye-bye.
See ya.